Hello, our dear subscribers. We are very happy to see you again on our channel. We try to create stories that inspire, delight, and make you think. Thank you for being with us. Rain had been pounding the windows of Nathan Brooks's office for hours, a relentless drumbeat that seemed to match the rhythm of his growing restlessness. The room that had once been a sanctuary for his creativity now felt like a crypt, the bookshelves lining the walls mocking him with their dusty spines. Nathan sat at his desk, a massive mahogany desk bought with the royalties from his first novel, and stared at the blinking cursor on his laptop screen. The document was called The Weight of Shadows, a psychological thriller he had promised his publisher would be his best work. It had been 8 months since he had written the last line, and the cursor had not moved an iota. Nathan was 42, though he looked older, as if the years were weighing on him more than they should have. His dark hair, once thick and wild, was now streaked with gray at the temples, and his brown eyes, once bright with wit, were dulled by sleepless nights and self-doubt. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with a lean frame that had softened slightly in recent years, the result of too many nights of bourbon and too few morning runs. His face, still handsome, was rough-featured, but lined with the fine lines of a man who had spent too much time battling his own mind. The office was on the second floor of their Brooklyn townhouse, purchased when Nathan's third novel hit the bestseller list. The walls were painted a deep forest green, and the single window looked out onto the street, where wet leaves clung to the sidewalk like forgotten promises. The room smelled faintly of old books, and the cedar candle Samantha had given him last Christmas, though he hadn't lit it in months. Samantha. The thought of her made his chest tighten. She was downstairs, probably drinking chamomile tea in the kitchen, her blonde hair pulled back into a messy bun, her yoga mat rolled up by the door. Or maybe she wasn't there. Maybe she was back at her class, which was getting later and later. Nathan's fingers hovered over the keyboard, then fell limply to his knees. He couldn't write. Not today. Not for months. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and rubbed his temples. The rain grew louder, its rhythm echoing the questions swirling in his head. Where did she go? Why had she gotten so cold? And why, when he asked about her day, did her answers sound like lines from a poorly memorized script? Nathan's phone vibrated on the table, startling him out of his thoughts. A message from his agent, Claire. Any progress on the manuscript? The publisher is nervous. He stared at the text, his finger hovering over the screen, but didn't respond. What could he say? That he was stuck? That his marriage was falling apart? That he was spending more time monitoring the comings and goings of his wife than he was writing? He stood up, stretching his stiff joints, and went to the window. The street below was quiet, save for a lone figure hurrying under an umbrella, his face hidden by the rain. Nathan's gaze slid across the street to the house across the street, where a warm light was burning in the living room. He saw silhouettes, probably Mr. and Mrs. Callahan, sharing a bottle of wine and laughing at some private joke. The sight stung him, reminding him of what he and Samantha had once shared. He turned away, his gaze caught on a framed photograph on the shelf. It was from their honeymoon in Maine, 10 years ago. Samantha was smiling widely, her blue eyes shining with love as she clung to him on the rocky beach, the wind tugging at her hair. Nathan had his arm around her, his smile boyish, carefree. He barely recognized himself. The sound of the front door opening made him jump. He glanced at his watch. 9:47 p.m. Samantha was back. He listened to the familiar rhythm of her movements, the soft thud of her yoga bag hitting the floor, the jingle of her keys being dropped on the hall table, the quiet murmur of her voice, as if she were talking to herself. Or someone else. Nathan's pulse quickened. He walked to the door of his office, hesitating before opening it. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the kitchen below. He walked down the stairs quietly, the wood cool against his bare feet. In the kitchen, Samantha stood at the counter, pouring hot water from the kettle into a mug. Her yoga clothes clung to her slender frame, and her hair was damp, either from the rain or sweat. She didn't notice him at first, focused on the tea bag she was mechanically lowering into the water. "Hi," Nathan said, his voice softer than he intended. Samantha flinched, her hand twitching, causing the water in her mug to splash slightly. "Oh my God, Nate, you scared me." She turned, forcing a weak smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I didn't hear you come down." "You're late," he said, leaning against the door frame. He tried to speak evenly, but his voice came out sharper than he intended. Her smile faltered. "Yeah, class ran late, and then the girls and I went for coffee." She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a nervous habit he'd noticed more often in recent months. "Coffee," he repeated, nodding slowly. "Must have been a damn good latte to keep you this long." She laughed, but it was thin and strained. "Just chatting with some friends, you know. Long time no see." Nathan looked at her, trying to catch something, a tone, a flicker of emotion that might give her away. But her face was a mask, carefully crafted. "Yeah," he said, crossing his arms. "Which friends?" Her gaze darted to him, then away. "Just people from class. You don't know them." "Tell." She sighed, setting her mug down with a soft clink. "Nate, what's with the interrogation? I'm tired, it's been a long day, I want to drink some tea and go to bed." He wanted to go on, to demand names, times, details, but her look irritated, almost pitying, stopped him. "Okay," he said, turning away. "I'll go back upstairs." "Good night," she called after him, but her voice was flat and lifeless. He didn't answer. Back in his office, Nathan sat at his desk, but the blank document taunted him. He opened a new browser tab, his fingers moving almost of their own accord. He typed Samantha Brooks into the search bar, then deleted it. What had he hoped to find? A secret blog detailing her late-night yoga adventures? A social media post with a strange hand on her shoulder? He leaned back, ran a hand through his hair, and stared at the ceiling. Samantha wasn't always like this. When they met, she was a graphic designer with an infectious laugh and a passion for her work that rivaled his own. They would talk for hours about art, books, how a single image or phrase could convey a truth too big for words. She was his muse, his conversationalist, someone who could pull him out of his own head when writing became overwhelming. But that was before the miscarriages. 2, back to back, 3 years ago. They'd tried to move past it, to recover, but something had changed. Samantha had thrown herself into work, then yoga, then this new version of herself, polished, distant, unapproachable. Nathan had tried to reach out to her, but every conversation had been a minefield. And now this, the late returns, the evasive answers, the way she sometimes looked at him as if he were an outsider in their own home. He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a small notebook covered with fragmentary thoughts and ideas. He flipped to a blank page and wrote, "She's hiding something." "I know." The words stared back at him, sharp and accusing. He tore the page out, crumpled it, and threw it in the trash. There was a soft clink downstairs as Samantha set her mug in the sink, then her footsteps on the stairs. He held his breath, waiting for her to stop at the study door, to say something, anything to close the gap between them. But she didn't. Her footsteps continued down the hall to the bedroom, and the door clicked softly shut. Nathan's gaze fell on the window again. The rain had stopped, leaving the street shiny and reflective, like a mirror of his own scattered thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, not by Samantha, not by anyone in particular, but by something larger, something that saw every crack in his carefully constructed life. He opened a new document, not The Weight of Shadows, but something else. He wrote, Chapter 1, The Watcher. The words seemed alive, insistent, as if they were waiting for him to release them. He didn't know where this story would lead, but for the first time in months, his fingers didn't waver. He was writing about a man who had seen too much, who couldn't stop seeing, even when it hurt. A man who watched his life fall apart and couldn't look away. The next morning, Nathan woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Samantha humming in the kitchen. It was a rare sound, once as familiar as his own heartbeat. He lay there for a minute, listening, trying to hold on to the warmth of this moment before it slipped away. The bedroom was bathed in soft gray light, the rain clouds still lingering. The bed on Samantha's side was already made, the sheets straightened with military precision. He found her in the kitchen, standing at the counter, expertly slicing an apple. She was wearing a cream sweater and jeans, her hair loose and shimmering in the light. For a moment, she looked like the woman in the photograph on the shelf, and his chest tightened with longing. "Good morning," he said, pouring himself some coffee. "Good," she replied without looking up. "Did you sleep well?" "Not really. And you?" She shrugged, popping a piece of apple into her mouth. "Fine, I guess. I have a client meeting at 10, so I'll be leaving soon." "Another early one," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "You've been busy lately." Her knife paused for a second. "Work is picking up speed. You know how it is." "Do I know?" The words escaped before he could stop them. Samantha slowly put the knife down. "What does that mean?" "Nothing," he said quickly, mentally cursing himself. "It's just, you're gone a lot. I miss you, that's all." Her face softened a little, but only a little. "I miss you too, Nate. But we both have our own things to do, right? You have your book, I have my work." "Book, repeat it, the word is bitter in the language." "Yes." She didn't pick up the topic, just picked up the knife and continued cutting. The silence hung between them, heavy, suffocating. Nathan took a sip of coffee, watching her over the rim of his mug. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical, as if she were performing for an invisible audience. "Sam," he finally said, setting down his mug, "are we okay? I mean us." She looked at him, her blue eyes calm but impenetrable. "Why not?" "I don't know. You tell me." She sighed, drying her hands on a towel. "Nate, I don't want to discuss this now. I have a meeting to get ready for." "Of course," he said, nodding. "Your meeting." She didn't answer, just gathered her things, phone, keys, black briefcase, and headed for the door. "I'll be back for dinner," she called over her shoulder. "Maybe we can get some of that Thai food you like." "Yeah," he said, but she had already left. Nathan spent the morning in his office, trying to catch the spark that had ignited the night before. He opened the Observer document and stared at the few paragraphs he had written. They were raw, unpolished, but there was something there, a pulse, a truth he hadn't touched in months. He wrote some more, describing the man's growing obsession with his wife, how every look, every word, was a clue to a hidden betrayal. By midday, he was fidgeting. The house seemed too quiet, too empty. He went downstairs, past the kitchen where the apple peels lay on the counter, already browning at the edges. He opened the refrigerator, then closed it without taking anything. His gaze fell on the yoga bag, still by the door where Samantha had left it yesterday. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe it was the weight of the silence or the fact that her answers never added up. He unzipped his bag and dug through it, a yoga mat, a bottle of water, an extra pair of leggings. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, in the side pocket, he found a receipt. From a coffee shop in Manhattan, dated last night, 8:32 p.m. order, 2 lattes and a slice of carrot cake. His stomach clenched. She'd said she'd been with girlfriends. Plural, so why only 2 drinks? He stuffed the check into his pocket and zipped up his bag. His heart was pounding, but he wasn't sure if it was anger or fear. He walked back to his office, opened his notebook, and wrote, 2 lattes. 8:32 p.m., who was she with? The words felt like a confession, a line he couldn't cross back over. He was watching her now, really watching her, and he wasn't sure he could stop. Morning came with a cold, gray light that filtered through the curtains, seeming to grudgingly illuminate the bedroom. Nathan lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, where the shadows of the branches outside the window danced in a slow, ominous rhythm. He had been awake for hours, the thought of the coffee shop receipt playing in his head like a broken record. 2 lattes, a slice of carrot cake. Someone was with her. Someone she hadn't mentioned. He turned his head, looking at the empty side of the bed. Samantha had left early, as usual, leaving behind only the faint scent of her perfume, jasmine, with a hint of vanilla that once made his heart beat faster, but now only heightened his anxiety. Nathan stood up, his muscles aching from the tension he'd built up overnight. He pulled on an old t-shirt and jeans, went downstairs, and made himself some coffee, but even the bitter taste couldn't clear the fog in his head. The house felt foreign, as if every room held secrets he hadn't figured out yet. He walked into the living room, where the sun was streaming through the cracks in the blinds, making streaks on the wood floor. On the coffee table was a magazine from the day before, open to an article about meditation and inner peace. Samantha was into that sort of thing these days, but Nathan couldn't help but think that her obsession with yoga and spiritual growth was just a facade for something else entirely. He went outside to get the mail, but his gaze fell on Samantha's car, a silver SUV parked at the curb. She rarely used it, preferring the subway or taxis to get into town. But yesterday, she said, she had stopped by for groceries after yoga. Nathan frowned, remembering that the refrigerator was nearly empty and there were no new bags in the kitchen. He approached the car, his steps slow, almost stealthy, as if he were afraid to wake something invisible. The driver's door was unlocked. Nathan opened it, and the smell of leather seats and the faintest hint of that same jasmine hit him. He sat in the driver's seat, feeling like an intruder in her world. His gaze slid over the dashboard, the empty coffee holder, the glove compartment, which he had opened on impulse. It held the usual things: an insurance card, a couple of pens, a pack of mints. But underneath it all, in the corner, there was a metallic glint. Nathan pulled out an object, a heavy lighter, silver and etched with a pattern of intertwined lines. It was a man's lighter, too bulky for Samantha's slender fingers, and definitely not his. He had never smoked, and Samantha had quit before they were married. His fingers tightened around the lighter, the metal cool against his skin. He turned it over, and on the back he saw initials JT. Nathan's heart began to beat faster. Who was JT? He tried to remember if Samantha had mentioned anyone with those initials, a coworker, a friend, a yoga instructor. But his mind was empty, just a dull echo of suspicion. He shoved the lighter into his jeans and closed the glove compartment, trying not to think about what that might mean. Back inside, Nathan headed for Samantha's bag, which was still by the door. He felt like a thief, but he couldn't stop himself. His hands shook as he unzipped it and began rummaging through its contents. A yoga mat, a bottle of water, a towel, all the same as yesterday. But in another side pocket, tucked deeper, he found something new, a small silk package. He unwrapped it and froze. Inside were black lace stockings and a set of underwear, thin, almost see-through, with an intricate pattern he'd never seen before. Samantha had always preferred simple, comfortable underwear, calling lace impractical. This wasn't her. Or maybe this was a new her, one he no longer knew. Nathan stood holding the stockings in his hands, the soft material of them feeling poisonous. His mind raced between explanations. Maybe they were a gift for him, a surprise she hadn't yet had a chance to give him. But then why hadn't she mentioned them? Why had she hidden them? And the lighter, whose was that? He dropped the package back into his bag, trying to pack it back the way it had been, but his fingers were shaking and he could feel a storm brewing inside him. That day Nathan was unable to return to his novel. Document Observe remained open, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he sat in his office, twirling the lighter in his hands, examining the initials T by the light of the desk lamp. He imagined this man tall, confident, with a charming smile that made Samantha laugh in a way she hadn't laughed with him in a long time. He hated this imaginary JT, but he hated himself even more for allowing his imagination to paint such pictures. Around lunchtime, he decided to go for a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear his head. Brooklyn was bustling despite the grayness of the day. Street vendors were shouting their offerings, children were running from school, laughing and pushing, and the smell of freshly baked bread wafted from the bakery on the corner. Nathan walked aimlessly, his steps heavy, as if he were dragging an invisible load behind him. He passed the coffee shop where, according to the receipt, Samantha had been the day before. The windows were large, overlooking the cozy tables inside. He imagined her there, sitting across from someone, her eyes shining as she listened to his stories. He paused, feeling the blood pounding in his temples, and forced himself to keep going. Back home, he tried to distract himself by turning on the television, but the news about politics and crime only made him more anxious. He turned it off and sat on the couch, looking at a photograph on the mantelpiece, another one from their first trip together to Vermont. Samantha had been wearing a knit sweater, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and he had been holding her from behind, laughing at something he had long since forgotten. Now the photograph seemed like a lie, a pretty cover for a story that was beginning to fall apart. He heard the front door open, and his body tensed. Samantha walked in, her steps light but tired. She dropped her bag on the floor and walked into the living room without noticing him right away. "Long day?" Nathan asked, his voice even but with a subtle edge to it. Samantha winced, then smiled, but it was a strange smile. Yes, the client was demanding. She took off her coat and hung it on a hook. "And how are you? Did you write anything?" "A little," he lied, watching her. She looked as always, beautiful and collected, but there was something vaguely alien about the way she moved. Maybe it was the tilt of her head, or the way she avoided his gaze, or the slight tremor in her fingers as she pulled her phone out of her pocket. "Okay," she said, heading into the kitchen. "Would you like me to cook something, or should we order?" "We'll order," he said, getting up from the sofa. "But first." He hesitated, not knowing how to begin. The lighter was burning his pocket, and the words about stockings and underwear were on the tip of his tongue, but he couldn't say them. "I found something in your car." Her hand froze on the refrigerator door. "What?" Her voice was calm, but there was a note of caution in it. A lighter. Silver, with the initials JT, he pulled it out of his pocket and placed it on the kitchen island between them, like evidence in court. Samantha looked at the lighter, her eyebrows raising slightly. "Oh, that. Probably one of the customers left it. I gave a coworker a ride last week, remember?" She picked up the lighter, turned it over in her hands, and shrugged. "I don't know whose it is. I don't smoke." "A colleague," Nathan repeated, his voice low, almost threatening. "What colleague?" "Nate, seriously?" She rolled her eyes, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her gaze. "It was Jason from my department. We were working on a project, and I gave him a ride to the subway. Probably him." "Jason," Nathan said, tasting the name. "JT Jason. What's his last name?" "Thompson," she said quickly, too quickly. "Look, I don't know what you're getting at. It's just lighter." "Just a lighter," he echoed, anger rising in his chest. "And the stockings? The lace underwear in your bag? That's simple too." Her face paled, but she quickly composed herself. "You were going through my bag." Her voice grew colder, with a note of accusation. "Nate, this is too much. Yes, I bought lingerie. I wanted to surprise you, but it looks like you ruined it." "Surprise," he said, not believing a word of it. "You don't wear that. Never have." "People change, Nate." She raised her voice, her cheeks turning pink. "Maybe I'm tired of being who you think I am. Maybe I want to feel desirable." The word hit him like a slap. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words died in his throat. She looked at him, her eyes full of challenge, but there was something else behind it, fear, guilt. He couldn't tell. "I don't know who you are," he said finally, his voice quiet but heavy as stone. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living with someone else's woman." Samantha froze, her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Silence hung between them, thick and sticky as tar. Then she turned away, picked up her phone, and began typing, as if his words meant nothing. "I'll order food," she said, not looking at him. "Thai, like you wanted." Nathan looked at her, feeling something inside him break. He turned and walked into his office, closing the door with a little more force than necessary. The lighter remained on the kitchen island, its silver glint a beacon guiding him through the dark waters of doubt. That night, Nathan couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark, listening to Samantha's even breathing, which seemed far too calm for a woman who had just had such a fight. He pictured JT, Jason Thompson, if she was telling the truth, and tried to remember if she had mentioned him before. He didn't know anyone by that name, but that didn't mean anything. Samantha had her own life, separate from his, and he was only just beginning to understand how big that gap was. He stood up, trying not to wake her, and crept into the office. He opened his laptop and began writing in a document. Observer's words flowed, as if his suspicions fed them. He wrote about a man who found clues: a lighter, underwear, a check, each one like a puzzle piece, but the puzzle didn't fit. He wrote about how this man began to see his wife as a stranger, how her every gesture, every word, became a riddle he had to solve. By morning, the document had grown to 2,000 words, and Nathan felt a strange sense of relief, as if by putting his fears on the page, he could at least temporarily escape them. But when he closed his laptop and looked at the lighter lying on the table, the relief evaporated. He knew this was just the beginning. He would watch her, search for answers, even if they destroyed him. Because he was no longer just a writer stuck in writer's block. He was an observer, and he couldn't stop. The Brooklyn night was thick as ink, spilled across the streets, where the street lamps cast dim pools of light that failed to pierce the darkness. Nathan Brooks' office was silent, save for the faint hum of his laptop and the occasional click of his mouse. On the desk in front of him lay a small box, its packaging carelessly torn open to reveal its contents. A miniature camera, barely larger than a coin, with a matte black body and a tiny lens like the pupil of some unknown creature. He had ordered it yesterday in a fit of desperation, after a lighter with his initials T and the lace lingerie in Samantha's bag had turned his suspicions into an almost tangible certainty. Now, holding the device in his hands, he felt it burning his fingers not physically, but mentally, as if he held the key to Pandora's box. Nathan leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping around the room. The bookshelves that had once inspired him now seemed to bear witness to his fall, their silent rows holding stories he could no longer write. On his laptop screen, a cursor blinks on a document observer where he pours out his fears, turning them into a fictional story about a man whose life collapses under the weight of the truth. But today he wasn't writing. Today he was going to take a step further, a step that could either save his marriage or destroy it completely. He stood up, clutching the camera in his fist, and walked quietly out of the office. The hallway was dark, the only light from the kitchen below casting long shadows on the walls. Samantha had left 2 hours ago, muttering something about taking a class at night and meeting up with her friends. Her words were like a broken record, and each time she repeated them, Nathan felt something inside him tighten, like a spring about to snap. He walked down to the bedroom, his steps almost silent on the polished parquet. The room greeted him with the scent of her perfume, the same jasmine that now conjured up secrets rather than warmth. The mirror in the bedroom sat opposite the bed, a massive one in a carved wooden frame they'd bought at a flea market in the early years of their marriage. They'd laughed when they'd chosen it, imagining how it would reflect their future mornings, their lazy weekends, their love. Now it seemed like the perfect place to watch. He attached a camera to the top of the frame, carefully tucked it into the decorative scrollwork, where it was nearly invisible. The tiny lens looked at the bed, the dresser, the door, the entire room that had once been their sanctuary. Nathan pulled out his phone, plugged in the app, and checked the settings. Recording was activated by any movement, saving the video to a cloud that only he could access. The phone's screen flickered, showing the empty room in real time. It was ready. His fingers shook as he pocketed the phone. He stood in the middle of the bedroom, looking at the bed, where the sheets still held the faint imprint of Samantha's body. He tried to remember the last time they had slept, pressed together, when her breath on his neck had been a promise, not a reminder of distance. But the memory slipped away, dissolving into cold reality. He felt like a stranger in his own life, a man looking at his wife through glass, unable to reach her. Back in his office, Nathan tried to distract himself by opening a document. Observer wrote a few lines, describing his hero setting up the camera, his heart pounding with a mixture of guilt and determination. But the words felt flat, lacking the spark that had once made his novels come alive. He slammed the laptop shut and went to the window, looking out. The rain had stopped, but the pavement glistened, reflecting the streetlights like shards of a broken mirror. Somewhere out there in the city, Samantha was. With who? With JT? Or someone else whose name he didn't even know? He took the lighter out of his pocket and turned it over in his hands. Initials JT seemed seared into his mind. Jason Thompson, she'd said. But her voice, too quick, too sure, sounded like a lie. Nathan opened his browser and typed in Jason Thompson, New York. The search returned hundreds of results: lawyers, realtors, trainers, none of whom seemed right. He tried graphic design, but that didn't yield anything specific. Then he typed in Jason Thompson, Yoga, New York. Nothing. He leaned back, feeling fatigue mingle with anger. He was looking for a ghost. The sound of the door opening made him jump. Samantha was back. He heard her drop her bag in the hallway, the jingle of her keys, and the sound of her humming softly, a tune he didn't recognize. His phone was on the table, the screen still showing the empty bedroom. He turned off the app, feeling the pressure building in his chest. He didn't want to go downstairs, didn't want to see her face, her smile that now felt like a mask. But he forced himself to get up and walk out into the hallway. Samantha was in the kitchen, pouring water into a glass. Her hair was a little disheveled, her cheeks were pink, as if she had been out for a long walk. She looked happy. It cut Nathan harder than he expected. "Hello," he said, trying to sound natural. "How was class?" She turned, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment he saw something in them, a shadow that she quickly hid. "Excellent," she said, taking a sip of water. "It was a terrific practice today. And you? Did you write anything?" "A little," he lied, leaning against the doorframe. "You're late. Coffee with your girlfriends again." She froze, the glass halfway to her lips. "No, just held up in the studio. Talking, you know." She put the glass down and began rummaging through her bag, as if looking for something to avoid looking at him. "Conversations," Nathan repeated, his voice soft but with a steely edge. "With whom?" She sighed, her shoulders tensing. "Nate, please, don't start again. It was just the instructor. We were discussing the schedule." "Instructor," he said, feeling the word scrape his throat. "What's his name?" "Her," she corrected, finally looking at him. "Her name is Leela. Leela Morgan. Want her number?" "Check." Her tone was sharp, almost challenging, and Nathan felt his cheeks heat up. He wanted to say something, to ask about the lighter, about the underwear, but the words were stuck. Instead, he nodded. "No, don't. I was just asking." She looked at him for another second, then turned away. "I'm going to take a shower," she said, walking out of the kitchen. Her steps were quick, almost hurried, and Nathan couldn't help but think that she was running from him. He waited until the sound of the bath water became steady before opening the app on his phone. The bedroom camera came to life, showing Samantha walking into the room, her clothes on the floor. She stood in front of the mirror, brushing her hair, her movements fluid, almost dance-like. Nathan watched, feeling both betrayed and victimized. She was doing nothing out of the ordinary, she was simply getting ready for bed, but every gesture seemed part of a larger mystery. He closed the app, unable to watch any longer. That night, he lay in the dark, listening to her breathe. The camera was there, a few feet away, a silent sentinel, ready to catch the truth. He imagined what it would show. Samantha talking on the phone to someone whose voice he didn't recognize. Samantha hiding something in a dresser drawer. Samantha no longer his. He hated himself for thinking these thoughts, but they were stronger than he was. In the morning, Samantha left early without saying a word. Nathan checked the app. The camera only recorded her night movements, nothing suspicious. But he knew it was only a matter of time. He opened the observer and began to write, describing a man whose life had become a hunt for the truth, whose eyes had become his curse. The words flowed like blood from a wound, and with each line Nathan felt himself getting closer to the edge of the abyss. The camera was his hidden eye, and it saw everything. But what if the truth it revealed was worse than his darkest fears? By the morning of the fourth day, Nathan felt like a shadow of his former self. His eyes, bloodshot from lack of sleep, burned with tension, and his fingers shook as he poured himself his third cup of coffee that morning. For the past 3 nights, he'd slept fitfully, waking at every noise, expecting his phone to vibrate with a new recording from the camera. But the app was silent, showing only short snippets. Samantha entering the bedroom to change. Samantha brushing her hair in front of the mirror. Samantha sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at her phone with an expression he couldn't decipher. Nothing out of the ordinary, and yet each moment only heightened his anxiety, as if the silence were the harbinger of a storm. The house felt like a cage, with every room holding traces of their past lives, the ones where they laughed, made plans, dreamed of the future. Now those memories were like exhibits in a museum, dusty and inaccessible. Nathan sat in his office, staring at the screen of his laptop, where a document observer froze on the last line. He waited, knowing the truth would come, but not knowing if he could bear it. He hadn't written since he'd set up the camera. His thoughts were too busy, too confused, to form words. Samantha left early, as usual, muttering something about meeting a client and taking a yoga class after. Her voice was even, but Nathan detected a slight tremor in it, as if she knew he was watching her even if she couldn't prove it. He walked her to the door, his gaze lingering involuntarily on her bag, where he had found stockings and underwear. She didn't notice his attention, or pretended not to, and left, leaving behind only the faint scent of jasmine. When the door closed, Nathan walked back into the office and opened the camera app. He scrolled through the last few days of footage, but nothing new appeared. His fingers hovered over the screen, and he felt a strange feeling brewing in his chest, a mixture of relief and disappointment. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe the lighter, the underwear, the receipt, all of this was just a coincidence, a figment of his paranoia. But then his phone vibrated, and a notification from the app flashed across the screen. New entry. 9:12. His heart leapt. Samantha had left less than an hour ago. Who could be in the bedroom? He opened the app, his fingers moving faster than his thoughts. The screen loaded, showing the bedroom in real time empty, bathed in the morning light that filtered through the curtains. But the recording, timestamped 9:12, was already saved to the cloud. Nathan clicked on it, blood pounding in his temples. The video began with a soft, rustling sound as someone entered the room. The camera, hidden in the frame of the mirror, caught Samantha's figure appearing in the frame, her movements quick, almost nervous. She dropped her bag on the floor and turned toward the door, as if expecting someone. Nathan held his breath, his fingers gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then a man appeared in the frame. He was young, no more than 30, with an athletic build and blonde hair pulled back into a messy bun. His clothes, a black sweatshirt and jeans, showed off his muscular frame, and he wore a small smile on his face that seemed both confident and amused. Samantha turned to him, and her lips curved into a smile Nathan hadn't seen in years, warm, almost playful. He stepped toward her, his hand brushing her shoulder, and she didn't pull away. "Chase, are you sure this is safe?" Her voice was quiet, but there was a mixture of excitement and anxiety in it. Nathan felt his stomach clench. Chase, the name cut through him like a knife. "Relax, Sam," the man replied, his voice low and slightly husky. "You said he's in his office all day, right? Writing his books." Samantha laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. "Yeah, he's not going to come out. But still, it's—" She trailed off, her hands fiddling with the hem of her sweater. Chase stepped closer, his fingers sliding down her waist, and she didn't pull away. "You think too much," he said, leaning in. Their lips met, and Nathan felt the world crumble around him. He wanted to turn off the video, but he couldn't take his eyes off it. The camera recorded everything, dispassionately. Chase removing Samantha's sweater, her fingers unbuttoning his shirt, them falling onto the bed, where Nathan had slept next to her just hours before. Their movements were greedy, almost desperate, and every sound, every breath the camera caught was etched into Nathan's mind like a shard of glass. He watched his Samantha, give herself to this man, her body arching under his hands, her voice whispering his name. It was betrayal, raw and naked, unfolding right there on their marital bed. The video ended 10 minutes later, as they stood up, dressed, and walked out of the room, laughing at something Nathan couldn't hear. He sat there, staring at the blank screen, his breathing ragged, a storm of anger and pain and disbelief raging in his chest. He rewound the footage, forcing himself to watch it again, hoping it was a mistake, that it wasn't her, not their bed, not his life. But every frame confirmed the truth he was so afraid to see. He threw the phone on the table, his hands shaking. A lighter with initials to T lay next to him, and now he knew it wasn't Jason Thompson. It was Chase. Chase, the fitness trainer whose smile and touch had stolen his wife. Nathan stood up, his steps heavy, as if he were walking on the ocean floor. He walked to the window, looking out at the street where life went on, indifferent to his pain. He didn't know what to do next: scream, cry, run after her. But he knew one thing for sure. The camera had shown him the truth, and now he couldn't forget it. Nathan sat in his office, shrouded in silence except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Its monotonous rhythm was the only sound keeping him from screaming, or breaking something, or running out of the house to find Samantha. His phone was on his desk, the screen dark, but the images from the recording still burned in his mind. Samantha, her laughter, her hands on Chase's body, their bodies entwined on their bed. Each frame was a blow, but instead of anger, Nathan felt something else building inside him, something cold and sharp, like a blade he could point not at her, but at the page. He opened his laptop, his fingers shaking, not from weakness, but from energy that needed an outlet. Document Observe looked at him like an old friend, ready to take on his pain. Nathan didn't bother to reread the previous lines. He didn't want to go back to what he had already written. Instead, he began a new chapter, his fingers flying across the keyboard, the words pouring out like blood from a fresh wound. This was not his usual style of writing: careful, measured, with long pauses to search for the perfect image. This was furious, almost feverish creativity, where every sentence was saturated with his pain, his betrayal, his thirst for revenge. The characters in his novel were beginning to take on faces. The wife, whom he called Eliza, was a replica of Samantha, not exact, but recognizable in every gesture. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her evasive answers, her smile that hid more than it revealed. The lover, whom he called Lucas, was Chase incarnate: young, confident, with a body honed by hours in the gym and a look that promised more than he could give. But the main character was Marcus, a husband whose life was crumbling under the weight of a truth he didn't want but couldn't help but seek. Marcus didn't scream, didn't punch the wall, didn't make a scene. He watched. And he planned. Nathan wrote of Marcus sitting in his office, surrounded by books that no longer brought him comfort. He described Marcus finding clues: a lighter, a receipt, traces of someone else's presence in their home. Every word was a sting, but it was also a release. He wasn't just retelling his story, he was rewriting it, giving Marcus something Nathan couldn't yet afford: control. In his novel, Marcus wasn't a victim. He was an architect of revenge, a man who took the pieces of his life and turned them into weapons. The hours passed unnoticed, and the study filled with the gray light of day that filtered through the curtains. Nathan did not notice hunger or fatigue. His world narrowed to a screen where lines multiplied like the cells of a virus. He wrote a scene where Marcus watches Eliza, noticing how she changes: her clothes become brighter, her smiles less frequent but sharper, as if intended for someone else. He described how Marcus finds a note in her bag, written in someone else's handwriting, and how this note becomes the last straw for him. But instead of storming into the bedroom with accusations, Marcus sits down at the table and begins to write not a novel, but a plan that would restore his dignity. Nathan paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He glanced at the lighter on the edge of the desk, its silver glint a beacon in the fog of his thoughts. He didn't know what to do with Samantha, with Chase, with the truth that now lay between them like a chasm. But Marcus knew. Marcus was stronger, smarter, more calculating. Nathan wrote of Marcus beginning to gather information, watching Lucas, learning his schedule, his habits, his weaknesses. He took his time. He waited like a predator who knew his prey would walk into his trap. The words flowed, and with each paragraph Nathan felt his pain transform. It didn't disappear, but it became something else, something he could mold. He described Marcus buying a camera like Nathan's and setting it up in his bedroom. He wrote about Marcus watching the footage, his heart clenching but his mind remaining cool. In the novel, Lucas wasn't just a lover. He was a symbol of everything Marcus had lost. His youth, his confidence, his control. And Marcus wasn't going to just accept it. By midday, Nathan heard the front door open. His fingers froze, his heart leapt. Samantha was back. He closed his laptop without saving the document. He knew he wouldn't forget a word of it. Her steps were light, almost carefree, and it cut him harder than he expected. She came into the kitchen, humming a tune he didn't recognize, and began rattling dishes. Nathan stood up, his movements slow, as if he were afraid to startle something fragile inside him. He walked downstairs, his gaze riveted on her figure. Samantha was standing at the stove, stirring something in a pot. Her hair was pulled up into a high bun, and she was wearing a loose white shirt that had once been his. The image, so familiar, so homely, was like a punch to the gut. How could she look so ordinary after what he had seen? "Hello," he said, his voice low but even. He didn't want to betray the storm raging inside. She turned, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment he saw something there, not guilt, not fear, but weariness. "Hi," she said, smiling. "I was thinking of making pasta. Want some?" He nodded, although food was the last thing on his mind. "How was your day?" "Oh, the usual bustle," she said, turning back to the stove. "Clients, yoga, the usual." "Yoga," he finished for her, his voice calm but with a hint of mockery in it. "Late again?" She froze, her hand hovering over the saucepan with the spoon. "Yes," she said after a pause. "We chatted a bit after. Nothing special." "We chatted," he repeated, feeling his fingers clenched into fists. "With Leela, huh? Or someone else?" Her shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn around. "Nate, I'm tired of you interrogating me," she said, her voice cold but trembling. "If you have something to say, just say it." He opened his mouth to answer, to scream Chase's name, to throw the truth he'd seen on the tape in her face. But instead he said, "Nothing, just asking." She nodded without looking at him and continued stirring the pasta. Nathan watched her, feeling his anger mingle with something new, determination. He would not make a scene. Not now. Not like this. He would go back to his novel, to Marcus, who knew what to do. Back in his office, Nathan opened his laptop and continued writing. His words were sharper now, darker. He described how Marcus was beginning to weave a web around Lucas, invisible but strong. He was watching him, learning where he lived, where he coached, who he dated. He was finding his weaknesses, his vanity, his habit of bragging on social media, his penchant for taking risks. Marcus was taking his time. He was putting the pieces of a puzzle together, like a chess player planning 10 moves ahead. Nathan wrote how Marcus meets Lucas face to face, not as an enemy, but as a casual acquaintance. He described their conversation in a cafe where Marcus feigns friendliness, asking questions that seem innocent but are actually fishing for information. Lucas, confident in his charm, doesn't notice how Marcus studies him, how he memorizes every detail. Nathan puts all his pain into this scene, but also his rage, turning it into Marcus's weapon. By evening, he had written almost 5,000 words, more than he had written in months. His fingers ached, his eyes burned, but he felt alive. For the first time in a long time, he was not just a victim of circumstances, but a creator. His novel was not just a story, it was his refuge, his plan, his revenge. Marcus was his reflection, but stronger, more determined. And although Nathan did not yet know how far he was willing to go in real life, he knew that Marcus would go all the way. When Samantha called him down to dinner, he came down, but his mind was elsewhere. He looked at her across the table, at her smile, at her hands as she handed him a plate of pasta. He saw Chase in her every move, in her every look. But he said nothing. He ate, answered her questions, even smiled when she told him something about her work. But inside he was Marcus, and he had already begun to weave his web. Night fell on the house, and Nathan lay in the darkness, listening to Samantha's breathing. It was even calm, as if she carried no burden of betrayal. He stared at the ceiling, where the shadows of the branches outside the window made patterns that resembled the cracks in his life. He thought about Marcus, how he had planned his revenge, not brutal, not impulsive, but cold as a chess game. Nathan didn't know if he would become Marcus in real life, but he knew that his novel was more than just words. It was his way of coping, his way of finding meaning in the pain that threatened to destroy him. He stood up, quietly, so as not to wake Samantha, and returned to the office. He opened his laptop and continued writing. Now Marcus was one step away from striking. He had found a way to trap Lucas, not physically, but psychologically. He had written a letter, anonymous but precise, designed to sow doubt in Lucas's mind, to make him look around, to suspect, to fear. Nathan described Marcus sending the letter, watching Lucas's reaction, how he began to get nervous, to lose his confidence. It was a revenge that did not require blood, but was no less devastating. By morning, Nathan had finished the chapter. His eyes were dry, his throat was parched, but he felt strangely satisfied. He didn't know what would happen next, not in the novel, not in his life. But he knew he wouldn't stop. His pain was ink, his rage was pen, and he would write until he found a way to regain control, or until he lost everything. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, painting the wooden floor warm, honey-colored. Nathan stood at the stove, flipping pancakes in the pan, their golden edges sizzling, filling the air with a scent of vanilla and butter. He hummed the melody of an old rock ballad, slightly out of tune, but with an enthusiasm that seemed almost genuine. His movements were easy, almost theatrical, as if he were playing a role in a play in which the lead character was the perfect husband, caring and attentive. But a storm was raging inside him, and each pancake he carefully transferred to a plate was another act of disguise. Samantha walked into the kitchen, her hair damp from the shower, her light cotton robe clinging softly to her figure. She looked fresh, almost innocent, and it cut through Nathan like a blade. He knew the truth, he'd seen it on the tape, felt it in every evasive look, in every word she said. But he smiled, wide and warm, as if nothing had changed. "Good morning, sunshine," he said, setting a plate of pancakes in front of her, topped with berries and a thin stream of maple syrup. "Thought I'd spoil you. How did you sleep?" Samantha looked at him, her eyebrows raising slightly, but she quickly hid her surprise behind a smile. "Oh, wow, Nate, that's sweet. Thank you." She sat down at the table, her fingers curling around her coffee mug. "Slept fine. What about you? You went to bed late last night, didn't you?" "Yeah," he said, sitting down across from her with his own plate. "Writing late. I think I finally found inspiration." He winked, his voice light, almost playful, but inside he could feel the words scraping his throat. "And you? How was your day yesterday? More yoga and clients?" She nodded, cutting off a piece of pancake. "Yes, everything is as usual. In the morning, there was a meeting with a new client, then a lesson. Leela came up with some new sequence and almost died of fatigue." She laughed, but the laugh was too loud, as if rehearsed. "Leela," Nathan repeated, spearing a berry with his fork. "She seems to know how to wear you out. Who else was in class?" His tone was casual, but his eyes followed her closely, catching every movement, every shadow on her face. Samantha shrugged, not looking up from her plate. "Just a normal group, nothing special." She took a sip of coffee, her fingers shaking slightly, but she quickly set the mug down. "What were you writing? Tell me, I know you love your stories." Nathan smiled, but it was as cold as a winter wind. "Oh, this is something new. The story of a man who discovers that his life is not what it seems. He watches, piecing together the truth like a puzzle. But the more he learns, the darker his world becomes." He paused, looking into her eyes. "Interesting, isn't it?" Her gaze faltered for a moment, but she quickly looked away. "That sounds dark," she said, trying to smile. "You always knew how to make it creepy. Maybe you could add something lighter to it. Love, for example?" "Love," he repeated, his voice quieter, almost a whisper. "Yes, maybe, but sometimes love is just a mask for something else entirely." Samantha looked at him, her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. She put down her fork and stood, straightening her robe. "I have to get ready," she said, her voice a little sharper than necessary. "It's a busy day." "Of course," Nathan replied, his smile unwavering. "Have a nice day, Sam." She nodded and walked away, leaving him alone with his half-eaten pancakes and his coffee growing cold. He stared at her empty plate, feeling something dark, almost tangible, growing inside him. She was lying. She lied so confidently, so smoothly, he almost admired her skill. But he knew the truth, and that truth was his weapon. Back in his office, Nathan opened his laptop and dove into observer. His fingers flew across the keyboard, the words pouring out so fast he could barely process them. He wrote about Marcus becoming increasingly calculating, his mind a labyrinth where every turn led to a new plan. Marcus wasn't just watching Eliza and Lucas, he was studying them like a scientist studying a rare species, noting every weakness, every crack in their facade. Nathan described Marcus finding Lucas's social media profile, where he bragged about his workouts, his expensive watches, his weekend getaways. He wrote about Marcus starting to leave anonymous comments, subtle but venomous, sowing doubt in Lucas's confidence. One comment, under a photo at the gym: "You look beautiful, but be careful, not all that glitters is gold." Lucas didn't respond, but Marcus saw how his posts became less frequent, how his smile in new photos lost its former cheekiness. Nathan poured all his pain into these scenes, but also his rage. He didn't just write, he created a world where he could control the outcome, where betrayal did not go unpunished. He described how Marcus begins to manipulate Eliza, asking her questions that seem innocent but make her nervous. In one scene, Marcus makes her breakfast, just like Nathan did this morning, and asks about her day with such warmth that she doesn't notice how her own answers become increasingly evasive. Nathan wrote how Marcus smiles, nods, but there is a cold determination in his eyes. He knows, and he waits. By lunchtime, Nathan had stopped, his fingers aching and his eyes burning with tension. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen where the words "observer" were now dozens of pages long. It was his best writing in years, dark, intense, raw, but it was also his most personal. Every word was ripped from his heart, every scene a reflection of his own life. He didn't know where Nathan ended and Marcus began, but it didn't matter anymore. Writing had become his way of surviving, his way of holding himself together when all he wanted to do was storm into Samantha's room and spill everything he knew. Samantha returned home that evening, her steps heavier than in the morning, as if the day had squeezed all the strength out of her. Nathan met her in the living room, holding a glass of wine not for himself, but for her. He handed it to her with a smile that was almost perfect. "Rough day?" he asked, his voice soft, almost gentle. "You look like you could use some relaxation." She took the glass, her fingers brushing against his, and for a moment he felt his skin burn from the contact. "Thank you," she said, taking a sip. "Yes, it's been a busy day. New project, lots of revisions. And you? Have you written anything?" "Oh yeah," he said, sitting down on the couch and gesturing for her to sit next to him. "I think I've hit on something. It's getting personal. You know when you write something and it just turns you inside out?" She looked at him, her eyes narrowing, but she quickly looked away. "That sounds intense," she said, her voice cautious. "Maybe you could tell me more? I've always loved your stories." "Maybe later," he said, his smile widening but his eyes still cold. "It's still very raw. But you know, there's this one scene about a guy who finds out he's being lied to. And he decides not to scream, not to make a scene. He just watches. And wait." Samantha froze, her glass halfway to her lips. "It's creepy," she said after a pause, trying to smile. "You always had a knack for suspense." "That's life, Sam," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Sometimes the truth is scarier than any fiction." She looked at him, her eyes lingering on his face for a moment, but she said nothing. She finished her wine and stood, muttering something about a shower and an early night. Nathan watched her go, feeling his heartbeat steadily but strongly like a drum. She didn't know that he knew. She didn't know that every step she took, every word she said, was only drawing her deeper into the web he was weaving not in life, yet, but on the page. That night, Nathan returned to his novel. He wrote about Marcus, who began to drop subtle, almost imperceptible hints to Elise. He left a newspaper with a headline about infidelity on the table, casually mentioning a friend who had been betrayed. He described how Elise became increasingly nervous, how her smiles became strained, how she began to look around, as if she sensed someone's eyes on her. Marcus was taking his time. He wanted her to begin to crumble under the weight of her lies. Nathan wrote until dawn, his words growing darker, more venomous. He described how Marcus found a way to meet Lucas again, this time at a bar, where he pretended to be a casual acquaintance interested in fitness. He asked questions about training, about life, about how Lucas spent his evenings. Lucas, confident in his charm, bragged, not noticing how Marcus memorized every detail, every weakness. Nathan poured all his hatred for Chase into that scene, but also his determination. Marcus was his reflection, but he was free of the doubts that plagued Nathan. By morning he had finished the chapter, his fingers shaking with fatigue, but his mind clear. He knew he would not stop. His novel had become his refuge, his weapon, his way of keeping himself in check. He would smile, make her breakfast, and ask about her day. He would be the perfect husband. But inside he would be Marcus, and he would watch, and write, and wait. Dim candlelight flickered across the table, casting soft shadows on the white tablecloth Nathan had pulled out of the closet for the first time in years. The dining room table was set with a meticulousness that was almost painful. China plates, crystal glasses, silverware polished to a shine. The aroma of grilled salmon with lemon sauce and fresh herbs hung in the air, mingling with the subtle scent of lavender from the candles. Nathan moved around the kitchen with the grace of a man who knows every step is part of a larger plan. He chopped herbs, checked the oven, tasted a sauce, but his mind was elsewhere, not on the culinary details, but on the scene he had been rehearsing in his head all day. Today, he was not just cooking dinner. Today, he was cooking an expose. Samantha arrived home later than usual, her steps slightly heavier than they had been this morning, as if an invisible weight were pressing down on her shoulders. She walked into the dining room, paused in the doorway, her eyes widening at the sight of the table. The dress she had chosen today, navy blue, with a low neckline, flattered her figure, but Nathan noticed the way her hands fiddled nervously with the strap of her bag. She hadn't expected that, and that was exactly what he wanted. "Nate, what is this?" she asked, her voice soft but wary. She set her bag down and walked over to the table, her fingers brushing the back of the chair. "This is unbelievable. What's the occasion?" Nathan smiled, his face a picture of warmth, but his eyes were cold as steel. "Just wanted to do something special," he said, pouring wine into glasses. "It's been so long since we've had a night out for two. Sit down, Sam. Relax." She nodded, her smile uncertain, but she sat down, her movements cautious, as if she were afraid to upset the delicate balance. Nathan placed a plate of salmon garnished with a sprig of dill in front of her and took his seat across from her. The candlelight reflected in her eyes, making them almost unreal, like the heroine of an old film noir. He raised his glass, tilting it slightly in her direction. "To us," he said, his voice low, almost intimate. "To all that we had, and all that will be." She froze, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass, but she lifted it, touching her glass to his. "To us," she echoed, but her voice wavered, and Nathan saw her gaze flicker to the glass before she took a sip. He watched her as they ate, making small talk. The weather, a new project at her job, the neighbor's cat who had gotten into their garden again. His words were light, almost playful, but every question, every comment was calculated like a chess move. He asked about her day, about yoga, about Leela, and each time she answered, he looked for cracks in her story, the same cracks he'd seen in her words for the past few weeks. "You're glowing today," he said, leaning a little closer across the table. "That dress, it suits you. Is it new?" She blushed, but her smile was strained. No, it's old. I just haven't worn it in a while. She cut a piece of salmon, but didn't bring it to her mouth, her fingers hovering over the plate. You seem different today. Is something wrong? Nathan laughed, the sound soft but sharp. Maybe I just miss you, he said, his eyes never leaving her face. You know, sometimes I look at you and think how little I know about you, like you're a mystery I'm still trying to figure out. Her lips twitched, but she quickly composed herself. You've always been a romantic, Nate, she said, trying to bring some lightness back into the conversation. But I'm not that complicated, just an ordinary woman. Ordinary, he repeated, his voice almost a whisper. No, Sam, you've never been ordinary. She looked at him, her eyes lingering on his face for a moment, but then she looked away, taking another sip of wine. Nathan noticed the slight tremor in her hand, and it gave him an odd satisfaction. She knew something was wrong. She just didn't know how close he was getting to the truth. After dinner, Nathan invited her to have more wine in the living room. He brought a bottle and 2 glasses, but underneath her glass, on a small glass table, was a flash drive, black, almost invisible against the dark surface. He pretended not to notice her gaze flicker over it as she picked up the glass. They sat on the couch, and Nathan put on some soft music, jazz, slow and melancholy, that filled the room like smoke. I found something today, he said, his voice casual, almost thoughtful. When I was cleaning out my office, an old flash drive. I think it had some videos on it. Maybe we should take a look. Maybe there's something interesting there. Samantha froze, her fingers tightening around her glass. Videos? She asked, her voice cautious. What videos? I don't know, he replied, shrugging. Maybe old records from our trips, or something from work. Want to check? She nodded, but her movements were slow, as if she were fighting the urge to refuse. Nathan stood up, picked up the flash drive, and walked over to the TV, plugging it into the port. The screen came to life, showing a black background and then a bedroom. Their bedroom. The camera hidden in the mirror captured everything. Samantha entering the room, her nervous movements, her smile as she turned toward the door. And then Chase. Samantha gasped, her glass tipping over and wine spilling onto her dress, leaving a dark stain. Nate, what is this? Her voice was hoarse, almost panicked. Where did this come from? He didn't answer, his eyes glued to the screen where Chase was holding her, where their lips were locked, where they were falling onto the bed. Samantha jumped up, her hands shaking. She took a step toward the TV as if to turn it off, but she froze, unable to look away. Her face went pale, her eyes filled with horror, and then with tears. Nate, she whispered, turning to him. It's not what you think. I can explain. Explain, he repeated, his voice calm but steely. He picked up the remote and turned off the television, leaving the room silent except for her ragged breathing. But that's not all, Sam. He took the second flash drive out of his pocket and inserted it into the laptop he had brought into the living room earlier. The screen lit up, showing a document observer. He opened the file, scrolled to the last chapters, and turned the laptop toward her. Read it, he said, his voice low, almost menacing. It's my novel, my best work, and you know what inspired it. Samantha stared at the screen, her eyes darting over the lines where Eliza and Lucas recounted their story, where Marcus spun his web of revenge. Her hands shook, and she covered her face with her palms, but Nathan didn't stop. You didn't just betray me, he said, his voice cold but filled with pain. You gave me back my story. She looked at him, her eyes full of tears, but there was no remorse in them, only fear and despair. Nate, I didn't mean to, she whispered. It was a mistake. Please, let me explain. He shook his head, his smile bitter, almost triumphant. No explanation needed, Sam. I saw it all, and I wrote it all down. Silence hung between them, heavy as lead. Samantha stood, her shoulders shaking, and Nathan looked at her, feeling his heart torn between anger and emptiness. He didn't know what would happen next, But in that moment, he was Marcus, and he was free. The next morning came with a harsh, cold light that cut into his eyes like shards of glass. Nathan had not slept. The night had passed in heavy silence, broken only by his own thoughts circling like vultures over carrion. He sat in the living room, looking at the empty couch where Samantha had sat the night before, her face twisted in terror and tears. The recording, the flash drive with the novel, his words, "You didn't just betray me. You gave me back my story." All of it hung in the air like toxic smoke that he could neither inhale or exhale. He knew that this morning would be the last act of their marriage, and he was ready to put an end to it. The kitchen smelled of last night's dinner lemon sauce, dill, wine that had spilled on Samantha's dress. Nathan walked past the table, not looking at the candles that had burned to the ground, leaving only puddles of wax. He went up to the bedroom, where the bed was neatly made, something Samantha always did automatically, even in the darkest moments. But now the habit seemed like a mockery, another layer of her lies. He opened the closet and pulled out her suitcase, the black, frayed one they had taken on their first trip to Vermont. They had laughed then, arguing over who would drag it up the snowy trail. Now he felt only the weight in his arms and the emptiness in his chest. Nathan began packing her things with mechanical precision. Dresses, blouses, jeans, whatever he could get his hands on, he stuffed into the suitcase, not caring about folding them neatly or choosing anything in particular. He found the lacy lingerie he'd seen in her bag, and for a moment his fingers froze, clutching the thin material. Anger flared in him, but he pushed it down, throwing the lingerie into the suitcase as if it were poison. He didn't want to think about Chase, about the way those things had touched her skin, about her wearing them for someone else. He just wanted her gone. When the suitcase was full, Nathan zipped it up and dragged it down the stairs. Each step felt like a hammer blow, but he didn't stop. He opened the front door and carried the suitcase out onto the porch, setting it down by the steps. The morning air was cool, with a hint of autumn, and a dog was barking in the distance. Nathan looked at the suitcase sitting on the concrete path and felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't just an action, it was a symbol. She didn't belong in this house anymore. She didn't belong to him. Samantha showed up an hour later. He heard her key turn in the lock, and his body went tense as she entered, her steps slow, hesitant, as if she were afraid of what she would find inside. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes red and dark under them. She looked as if she hadn't slept, and for a moment Nathan felt a twinge of pity, but he quickly suppressed it. Pity was a luxury he could no longer afford. "Nate," her voice was hoarse, almost cracking. She paused in the hallway, her gaze falling on the empty space where her bag usually sat. Where are my things?" He came out of the living room, his arms crossed over his chest, his face unreadable. "On the porch," he said, his voice level but steely. "I packed your suitcase. It's time for you to go." Her eyes widened, her lips twitching. "What?" She took a step toward him, her hands flying out as if to grab his shoulders, but stopped. "Nate, are you serious? You're just kicking me out?" "What did you expect, Sam?" His voice grew louder, sharper, like a blade he'd held back for too long. "That I'd sit and watch you have sex with that bastard in our bed. That I'd swallow your lies and pretend everything was okay." She flinched as if struck, her face going pale. "Nate, please," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "It was a mistake. I didn't mean to hurt you. Let's talk. I'll explain everything." "Explain?" He laughed, but it was bitter, almost growling. "Do you think I want to hear your tales about Leela, about yoga, about clients? I saw it all, Sam. I saw you with him, and I don't want to hear another word." She stepped closer, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Nate, I'm begging you. It was one time. I was lost. I didn't know how to deal with us. You know how hard it was for us." "It's hard," he raised his voice, his fists clenched so hard his nails dug into his palms. "It was hard for you, and you decided to go get some fucking fitness trainer. Is this your way of coping, Sam? Throwing away everything we had for his fucking smile?" Her face twisted, and the tears turned to anger. "Don't you dare say that," she screamed, her voice shaking but with strength. "You think it's all my fault? Where were you, Nate? In your office, staring at your damn laptop while I was trying to keep us together. You didn't even notice me." "You didn't notice?" He took a step toward her, his eyes blazing. "I noticed everything, Sam. Every lie you told, every time you left, every time you looked at me when you thought I wasn't looking. I noticed how you pulled away, how you started living your own life where I didn't belong. And I gave you a chance. I waited, but you chose him." She shook her head, her hands clenched into fists. "You don't understand. Chase, he was there when you weren't. He listened to me, he—" "Listened to you?" Nathan cut her off, his voice cold as ice. "He had sex with you in our bed, Sam. Don't tell me how he listened to you. I saw him do it, and I wrote about it." She froze, her eyes widened, as if she had just now remembered about the novel, about the flash drive, about Observer U. "You wouldn't dare," she whispered, her voice full of panic. "You can't publish this. It would destroy me, Nate. Do you want that? Do you want to ruin my life?" He looked at her, his face still, but inside him a storm was raging. "You've already destroyed mine," he said quietly, but each word was like a blow. "Now take your suitcase and go." She screamed, her voice breaking into hysteria. "You can't do this to me. This is my home too. I'm not leaving, Nate. You can't just throw me out like trash." "This stopped being your home when you brought him here," he said, his voice calm but final. He turned, walked to the door, and opened it, gesturing toward the porch where the suitcase sat. "Go away. Now." Samantha stood, her chest heaving with her heavy breathing, tears streaming down her face, mixing with her mascara. She took a step toward him, her hands outstretched as if to grab him, to hold him, but he stepped back, his gaze unreadable. "Nate, please." Her voice was quieter, almost pleading. "I love you. I know I screwed up, but I love you. Give me a chance. We can make this work." He looked at her, and for a moment his resolve wavered. He remembered their first meeting, her laugh, her hand in his, their nights lying staring at the ceiling and talking about the future. But then he remembered the tape, her smile at Chase, her body under his arms. And his heart turned to stone again. "You don't love me," he said, his voice empty, like an echo in an abandoned house. "You love your lies, and I don't want to be part of them anymore." He stepped toward the door, holding it open. Samantha looked at him, her lip trembling, but then she turned, grabbed her bag, which was in the hallway, and stepped out onto the porch. Nathan watched her pick up her suitcase, her shoulders shaking with sobs as she walked down the steps. He closed the door, slowly but firmly, and the sound of the lock clicking into the silence was like a full stop in their story. Nathan walked back into the living room and sat on the sofa, his hands in his lap, his fingers clasped together. The house was empty, too big for one person. He felt the silence that enveloped him like a shroud, but in that silence there was relief. She was gone. She was no longer in his life, only in his novel, where Eliza still lived, still lied, still fell under the weight of her mistakes. He stood up, walked to his office, and opened his laptop. Document Observe waited for him, the cursor blinking like a pulse. Nathan began to write, his fingers moving slowly but surely. He described Marcus standing at the window, looking out onto the empty street where Eliza had just disappeared. He wrote about Marcus feeling empty, but also free. His revenge was not in screaming, not in violence, but in the words he would leave behind. Nathan wrote about Marcus finishing his novel, sending it to a publisher, knowing that the story would be his triumph and her downfall. By morning, he had finished the chapter. His eyes were burning, his fingers were aching, but he felt alive. Samantha was out of his life, like a character he had written out of the plot. But in Observer it will remain forever as a reminder, as a warning, as his greatest victory. The silence in Nathan's house was his new companion, but it was no longer oppressive. It was like a blank sheet of paper, waiting for his words. It had been 3 months since Samantha had left, leaving behind only the echo of her footsteps on the porch and the suitcase he had so carefully packed. Her absence had not erased the pain, but it had turned it into fuel that fueled his writing. Nathan wrote every day, sometimes until dawn, until his fingers began to tremble with fatigue and his eyes began to burn with effort. His novel, Observer, was more than just a story. It was his confession, his revenge, his triumph. But he knew he couldn't publish it under his own name. There was too much truth in it, too much of his own life. He chose a pen name Elias Gray, a name that sounded like a shadow, like a ghost he felt inside himself. Nathan finished the novel in mid-autumn, when the leaves outside his office window were turning crimson and gold, falling to the sidewalk like scraps of old memories. He sat at his laptop, rereading the final chapter, where Marcus, his alter ego, submitted his novel to a publisher, knowing that this story would change his life. Nathan wasn't sure if his own novel would change anything, but he felt he had to get it out into the world. He edited the text, polished every line until it was razor sharp, and sent the manuscript to Amazon's Kindle Direct publishing platform. The title came to him at the last minute. Mirror Opposite was perfect, a reflection of his pain, his observations, his truth, hidden in the mirror of their bedroom. Publishing was a simple act. A few clicks, uploading a file, choosing a cover minimalist, with an image of a mirror cracked in the middle. Nathan didn't expect much. His previous books, written in the happier years, had sold modestly, garnering a few rave reviews from devoted readers, but had never risen above the average positions in the ratings. He thought That Mirror Opposite would just be another drop in the sea of stories that no one would notice. But he was wrong. A week after publication, Nathan received his first notification from Amazon. His book had entered the top 100 in the psychological thriller category. He sat at his desk, staring at the screen, and couldn't believe his eyes. He refreshed the page, thinking it was a mistake, but the numbers hadn't changed. By the end of the second week, Mirror Opposite rocketed into the top 10, and the reviews began pouring in like autumn rain. Readers called it devastating, brilliantly dark, a story that makes your heart beat faster and hurts at the same time. One reviewer wrote, "Elias Gray is a dark version of Stephen King and Nicholas Sparks rolled into one. He writes about love as if it were a weapon and betrayal as if it were art." Nathan's lips curled into a smile as he read those words. He hadn't expected his pain, his anger, his personal tragedy to resonate with thousands of strangers. But they did. Readers wrote about how Marcus and Eliza's story had made them rethink their own relationships, their fears, their secrets. They saw Marcus not just as a hero, but as a man whose thirst for truth had been his salvation and his curse. Nathan felt his old self, the writer who had lost his spark, resurrecting with every new review, with every jump in the rankings. By the end of the month, Mirror Opposite became the #1 thriller bestseller on Amazon Kindle. Social media was abuzz with discussion, with fans creating threads on X sharing theories about who Elias Gray was and what inspired the story. Some suggested it was a pseudonym for a famous author hiding from the spotlight. Others argued that the story was too personal to be fiction. Nathan read the posts in his office and felt a strange mix of pride and anxiety. He didn't want fame. He wanted his story to be heard, but he didn't want anyone to see his own life in it. One evening, as the rain pounded the windows, Nathan received a letter from a literary agent. Her name was Clara Vane, and she represented one of the largest publishing houses in New York. She wrote, "That Mirror Opposite has caught their attention, and they want to discuss the possibility of a paperback edition and international rights." She called the book a phenomenon and suggested a meeting. Nathan read the letter 3 times, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He wasn't ready for this, for the meetings, for the interviews, for the questions about who Elias Gray was. But he knew he couldn't stop. His novel had become bigger than him, and he had to keep going. He agreed to meet, but insisted that it be via video link. Clara was a woman in her 40s, with sharp eyes and a voice that was both warm and businesslike. She sat in her office, surrounded by books, talking about Mirror Opposite as if it was not just a book, but a cultural event. "Elias," she said, leaning towards the camera, "your book is something special. It touches a nerve. Readers feel your pain, your rage. It's not just a thriller, it's a confession. Where did you draw your inspiration from? Nathan, hidden behind the screen and the pseudonym, smiled, but his eyes remained cold. Life, he said, his voice low, almost thoughtful. Sometimes it gives you stories you can't help but write. Clara nodded, her gaze intent, as if she were trying to figure him out. You don't like to talk about yourself, do you? She asked, her lips curling into a slight smile. That's normal. The mystery only adds to your charm. But tell me, are you planning a sequel? Readers are already clamoring for a second installment. Nathan thought about it. He didn't think about continuing. Mirror Opposite had been his way of dealing with Samantha, with Chase, with the betrayal. But now that the book was a bestseller, he felt like Marcus, Eliza, and Lucas were still in his head, demanding more chapters. Maybe, he said after a pause, but I don't want to rush it. The story has to be honest. Clara nodded, her eyes lighting up. Honesty is what makes your book special. We want to publish it in hardcover and translate it into several languages. And Elias, I must warn you, you will be invited to talk shows, to festivals. Are you ready for this? I'm not sure, he replied, his voice sincere. I'm a writer, not a showman, but I'll think about it. After the call, Nathan walked out onto the porch where he had once left Samantha's suitcase. He breathed in the cold air, looking out at the street, where the leaves swirled in the streetlight. He thought of her, not longingly, but with cold clarity. She was out there, somewhere in the city, maybe with Chase, maybe alone. He didn't know if she was reading. Mirror Opposite, but part of him hoped she would read it. He wanted her to see how her betrayal had been his triumph, how her lie had given him a voice that the whole world could hear. He returned to his office and opened his laptop. His inbox was flooded with messages from readers, publishers, and journalists. One of them, a blogger with an X, was asking for an interview, promising to uncover the secret of Elias Gray. Nathan smiled but didn't answer. He wasn't prepared for the spotlight, for questions about how autobiographical his novel was. He was a writer, and his truth lived on the page, not in the headlines. He opened the document Observe and began writing a new chapter, not knowing whether it would be part of a sequel or just his personal diary. He described how Marcus was on the threshold of a new stage in his life, how his novel became a bestseller, but did not bring him peace. Marcus still saw Eliza in his dreams, but now she was not his wife, but a ghost who reminded him of the price of truth. Nathan wrote how Marcus began a new story, but this time it was not about revenge, but about forgiveness not for her, but for himself. By morning he had finished the chapter, his fingers shaking but his mind clear. He was a writer again, not the man he had been before Samantha, but someone knew Elias Gray, a man who had turned his pain into art. Mirror Opposite was his mirror, his truth, his victory. And although he didn't know what lay ahead, he knew one thing. He would write. Always. A year had passed like a shadow sliding across a wall in the pre-dawn hours, fast, elusive, but leaving a mark that could never be erased. Nathan stood in front of the mirror in his bedroom, the same one that had once held his camera, his secret, his pain. The mirror had hung there, a silent witness to their broken marriage, but now it was just an object, glass framed in wood, with no hidden wires or lenses. The camera had long since been turned off, removed and tucked away in a drawer with other relics of his past. Their wedding rings, a photo from their first anniversary, a lighter with his initials Chati, which he had never thrown away. He looked at his reflection, and it was no longer the man who had trembled with anger and despair a year ago. In the mirror was a man whose eyes were clear, whose posture was straight, whose soul had finally found peace. Outside, autumn was soft, with golden leaves swirling in the breeze and the air filled with the scent of damp earth. Nathan loved this time of year. It seemed honest to him, revealing its decay but promising a new beginning. He felt part of the cycle, a man who had passed through the winter of his life and now stood on the threshold of spring. His novel, Mirror Opposite, under the pseudonym Elias Gray, became not just a bestseller, but a phenomenon translated into a dozen languages, discussed at book clubs and literary festivals. Readers called him the voice of pain and renewal, and Nathan, reading those words, felt for the first time in a long time that his voice was heard. But the road to this moment was long, full of legal battles, sleepless nights, and questions he didn't always have answers to. The divorce from Samantha wasn't easy, not because they were fighting over property or money, but because it was the final act of their shared story, where each tried to defend their own truth. The divorce began a week after Nathan carried her suitcase out onto the porch. Samantha didn't return that day, but a few days later he received a letter from her lawyer, a dry, formal one, demanding that they divide their property and negotiate terms. Nathan hired his own lawyer, a woman named Emma Reed, whose forthrightness and sharp wit reminded him of Clara Vane, his literary agent. Emma sat across from him in her office, her wire-rimmed glasses gleaming in the lamplight, and spoke to him as if he were not a client but a chess partner. "Nathan," she said, leafing through the papers, "I know this is emotionally difficult, but we need to be pragmatic. Samantha wants half the house and a share of your book profits if it comes out. She claims her investment in your marriage entitles her to it." Nathan looked at her, his fingers wrapped around the pen he'd been signing the papers with. "She betrayed me, Emma," he said, his voice calm but weary. "She slept with someone else in our bed, and now she wants my book, my story." Emma nodded, her gaze sympathetic but businesslike. "I understand, and we'll use that. But the courts don't like emotion, they like facts. Do you have evidence of her infidelity?" He nodded, thinking about the flash drive, the recording that was still in his drawer. "Yeah, the video. But I don't want it to be public. It's too personal." Emma leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping the table. "Okay, we can use this as leverage without showing it in court. If she pushes, we'll hint that we have evidence. That's usually enough to get the other side to compromise." Nathan agreed, although part of him wanted Samantha to feel the full weight of her guilt publicly. But he knew that wasn't his path. His revenge was in mirror opposite, in the words he wrote, in the story that had already begun to change his life. He didn't want the divorce to be a circus, he wanted it to be a period, not an ellipsis. Negotiations dragged on for months. Samantha, through her lawyer, demanded half of the house, claiming she had invested as much in it as Nathan. She also tried to claim a share of the proceeds from mirrors opposite, arguing that their marriage was part of the inspiration for the book. Nathan listened to these arguments in meetings, sitting across from her lawyer, whose face was as impassive as his own. Samantha did not show up for these meetings, she communicated only through a representative, and that was another blow. He wanted to see her eyes, he wanted to hear her voice, he wanted to know if she felt any regret. But she remained a ghost, present only in documents and signatures. Emma proved to be a master of her craft. She found loopholes in the contracts she and Samantha signed when they bought the house and proved that Nathan had contributed the majority of the funds. She also insisted that Mirror Opposite was created after their actual breakup, making Samantha's claim to the book's proceeds legally invalid. Nathan listened to Emma lay out the facts for Samantha's lawyer and felt a strange satisfaction. It wasn't the kind of revenge he'd described in his novel, but it was real, tangible, like the sound of a gavel in court. Eventually, they came to an agreement. Samantha received a small settlement for her share of the house, but Nathan retained ownership. She waived any claim to his book, and he, in turn, agreed not to use the recording in court. When the agreement was signed, Nathan felt an invisible weight lift from his shoulders. He was free not just from Samantha, but from the history they shared that had held him captive for so long. After the divorce, Nathan returned to his life, but it was no longer the same. Success Mirrors Opposite changed everything. His inbox was flooded with letters from readers sharing their stories of betrayal, pain, and healing. He read them in his office and felt that his novel had become more than just his personal confession. It had become a bridge connecting him to others whose hearts had been broken, but not broken. Clara Vane, his literary agent, became his guide to the new world. She organized the publication Mirrors Opposite in hardcover, and the book hit bookstore shelves around the world. Nathan avoided public speaking, but agreed to a few interviews conducted anonymously via text or audio, not video. He talked about his art, about how pain can become art, but he never revealed that Eliza was Samantha and Lucas was Chase. He wanted his story to live its own life, separate from his personal tragedy. One day, while sitting in a cafe in the city center, Nathan noticed a woman reading mirror opposite Tesh was immersed in the book, her fingers turning the pages greedily, her face changing emotions from surprise to sympathy. Nathan looked at her, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. His words, his pain, his truth had found their reader. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but in that moment he felt that they were connected through the lines he wrote, through the emotions he put into each word. That evening, when Nathan returned home, he walked into his bedroom and stood in front of the mirror. He looked at his reflection, and there was no anger, no pain, no sadness. He saw a man who had been through hell and came out the other side, not unscathed, but stronger than before. His hair was slightly grayer at the temples, the lines around his eyes were deeper, but there was a clarity in his gaze that only comes with acceptance. He no longer stalked Samantha, didn't look for her on social media, didn't wonder where she was or who she was with. She was part of his past, part of his book, but not part of his future. He thought of Marcus, his hero, who in mirror opposite found a way to forgive himself. Nathan wrote this scene in the last chapter he finished this morning. Marcus stands in front of a mirror, just like Nathan's, and looks at his reflection. He doesn't see Eliza, he doesn't see Lucas. He sees only himself, a man who has survived betrayal and found meaning in it. Nathan wrote Marcus starting a new book, not about revenge, not about pain, but about hope. And although Nathan didn't know if he would write a sequel Mirrors Opposite, he felt that his own history was now going in a new direction. He turned to the window, where the autumn wind blew leaves down the street. The house was quiet, but the silence was no longer empty. It was full of possibilities, new words, new stories, new life. Nathan knew that his rebirth had not begun with the success of his book, or the divorce, or Samantha's departure. It had begun the moment he decided to write the truth, the moment he turned his pain into art. And now, standing before the mirror, he was ready to move on not as a victim, not as an avenger, but as a writer whose story was just beginning. Thank you for sticking with us until the very end. We really appreciate your support and attention. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment on what you think. See you soon. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.